My name is Elizabeth. The fork was still halfway to my mouth when my mother, Vivian, said it. Give me the money and stop being a leech. Her voice was like a thunderclap in the otherwise calm room, louder than the clinking of glasses and the light-hearted chatter that had filled the air just moments ago. It was a voice meant to wound, to shame, and to ensure that everyone at the family dinner heard. My brother, Ryan, froze in mid-chew. My cousin, Lily, stopped pouring the wine. Even my youngest niece, Ava, looked up from her phone. All eyes were on me. I gently set my fork down, my napkin still neatly folded on my lap. And then, I did something that caught everyone off guard. I laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh or a hysterical one. It was a low, steady chuckle, as if I had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Across the table, Vivian's face contorted in confusion, then annoyance. She leaned forward as if she hadn't just dropped a bombshell. I mean it, Elizabeth, she snapped. It's about time you grew up and stopped depending on other people. Your father would be ashamed if he saw what you've become. That statement made me pause, not because it hurt, but because it didn't. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles on my dress. The room fell into a deafening silence. No, I said calmly, looking her straight in the eye. He'd be ashamed of you. She blinked in surprise. I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick white envelope I'd been carrying around for months. I walked over to the center of the table and placed it between the butter dish and the salt shaker. What is this? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. A reminder, I replied. That you've been living in a house you don't own, paid for by the daughter you just called a leech. With that, I turned and left the room, leaving behind a stunned silence. As I walked out, I couldn't help but think about how we got to this point. My father passed away suddenly. Instead of focusing on the funeral arrangements or dealing with her grief, Vivian's first words were, "What am I supposed to do now?" I knew she meant it financially. Within 2 weeks, she showed up at my doorstep with 3 suitcases and a box labeled important papers, which was mostly filled with old tax documents and unpaid bills. She never even asked if she could stay, she just assumed it was her right. I silently took on the responsibility of paying for everything. I covered the utilities, bought the groceries, and paid the minimums on her credit cards. When her car needed new tires, I footed the bill. And when she overdrew her checking account for the 5th time that year, I covered the balance. I even added her cell phone bill to my auto-pay so she wouldn't have to face the humiliation of having her service cut off. But Vivian never showed any gratitude. At family gatherings, she'd brag about how she kept the household running and how I was lucky she didn't charge me rent. When my uncle joked that I owed her room service, she laughed and said she lived like a queen while I paid for everything. Everyone just nodded and smiled, and I said nothing. I thought it was easier to let her have the credit and keep the peace. Over time, I started to notice how she twisted the story. It was no longer about me letting her move in, it was about her rescuing me. She claimed to be the one shouldering the financial burden, while I was just a burden she tolerated out of kindness. And every time I let her get away with it, I felt like I was validating her lies. I started keeping receipts, bank statements, and transfer logs. It wasn't because I wanted revenge, it was because I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. And that proof came in handy on the night she called me a leech. There were always signs of her selfishness. The first time I said no to a vacation she wanted, one that I would have had to finance, she called me selfish. You're lucky I don't charge you for all the things I've done, she said, tossing the travel catalog onto the kitchen counter. When I wore a second-hand blazer to a cousin's wedding, she pulled me aside before we entered the venue and hissed, "Don't embarrass me tonight." I just smiled and adjusted the sleeves, knowing that the tags were gone, but her judgment remained. She'd whisper to relatives when she thought I couldn't hear. "She means well, but she wouldn't survive without me," she'd say. And then she'd say it louder, just to make sure I heard. Some people just never grow up. At first, I laughed it off. Then I tried to downplay it. But eventually, I just swallowed my pride and let it go. A friend once came over while Vivian was ranting about how I'd forgotten to refill her medication, even though it was sitting in a paper bag on the counter. After she left the room, my friend asked, "Why do you let her talk to you like that?" I didn't have an answer. I loved her, she was my mother, and I never learned that love didn't mean letting someone erode my self-worth. After that, I stopped inviting people over. It was easier to pretend I preferred solitude than to explain what I was going through. A few months before the dinner, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I opened a holding company under the name of a long-deceased great-aunt. It was a simple way to keep Vivian from snooping around. She didn't know how to read property records, but she'd get suspicious if the names were too familiar. I bought the house we were living in. I was tired of being reminded that it wasn't mine. Every time she told someone I was lucky she'd helped me, every time she slammed a door and said, "My roof, my rules," it felt like a stab in the heart. I knew that one day, I'd need proof of my ownership. The mortgage payments, taxes, and insurance were all routed through the holding company. I kept the original documents in a safe deposit box and carried copies with me everywhere. I told Vivian I'd been laid off from my consulting firm. I said it was just budget cuts, a common occurrence. She didn't ask for details, she only asked, "So, what does that mean for me?" I shrugged and said we'd have to be more careful with money. That week, I started making changes. I stopped buying fancy coffee, stopped getting fresh cut flowers for the foyer, and the Amazon deliveries stopped. I wore the same 3 sweaters from the thrift store, and I let my gray hair show. Vivian noticed the changes. She started sighing louder when the Wi-Fi went out and made backhanded comments about how the house used to be nicer. She canceled her yoga membership on my card and told her friends I was going through a tough time. What she didn't know was that my business had never been better. My firm had quietly expanded, and my investments were earning more each month than most people made in a year. I wanted to see how she'd react when there was nothing left for her to take. It didn't take long. She started calling me useless when she thought I couldn't hear. At a birthday party, she told my cousin that I was draining her spirit. One night, I heard her on the phone with an aunt, saying, "She sits around all day pretending to be busy. It's pathetic." I was folding laundry at the time, clothes that I'd bought with my own money for both of us. That night, I took the wine out of the shared fridge and put it in a small cooler in my closet. I wanted to see what she'd do when I stopped catering to her. And as expected, she started lashing out. A few days later, Vivian told me we'd be hosting a family dinner on Friday. She said it would be a simple get-together, nothing fancy. I didn't ask why she suddenly wanted to play hostess, I already knew. By Friday evening, the table was set like a high-end restaurant, with linen napkins, crystal glasses, and candles that hadn't been lit in years. Vivian wore one of her expensive blouses, the kind she only wore for special occasions. I made the garlic bread, and she added too much salt to the roast. We didn't say much in the kitchen. Family members arrived one by one. Ryan brought a bottle of wine, which Vivian sniffed at before thanking him. For a while, the dinner was civil, almost pleasant. Vivian flitted around the table, smiling too widely and laughing too loudly. Then, she stood up and tapped her glass. "I just want to say something," she said, her voice sharp beneath the false sweetness. "This woman," she pointed at me, "has been living off me for far too long. I raised her, I gave her everything, and now she can't even hold down a job. She hides behind her laptop all day and expects me to pay the bills and clean up her messes." The room fell silent. No one moved or interrupted. "She owes me," she hissed, her voice rising. "And I'm sick of it." She slammed her hand on the table. "Give me the money and stop being a leech." I felt my hand tighten around my napkin. I looked around at the faces of my family members, a mix of confusion, embarrassment, and even a bit of entertainment. And I knew that this was the moment I'd been waiting for. I laughed, a sharp, sudden laugh, like a breath I'd been holding for years. What's so funny? Vivian demanded. I stood up, pulled the envelope from my bag, and laid it gently in front of her plate. You want money? I asked calmly. You've already had hundreds of thousands of dollars from me. You just never noticed. I looked around the table. Let's clear a few things up. I'm not unemployed. I own a consulting firm that grossed nearly $1,800,000 last year. I downsized on purpose. I dressed like this on purpose to see how you'd react. Vivian looked like she was about to choke. I own this house, I continued. I bought it 2 years ago through a holding company. Every inch of this place is mine. I met her eyes. Since you've made it clear that I'm nothing more than a leech to you, I think it's time we end this arrangement. She opened the envelope with shaking hands. The room was so quiet that I could hear the paper rip. Those are your 30-day eviction papers, I said. They're already notarized. I turned to the rest of the table. For those of you wondering what just happened, you've been watching a woman insult her landlord at her own eviction dinner. With that, I picked up my coat and walked out. The next morning, the drama started. Vivian wasted no time in spreading her version of the story. By sunrise, my phone was buzzing with texts from relatives I hadn't heard from in months. What's going on? Your mom is saying you've lost it, they wrote. I didn't reply. By noon, Aunt Grace left me a voicemail filled with tears and judgment. I don't know what's gotten into you. Kicking your own mother out of her home. You need help. By afternoon, my cousin Lily had reposted a vague status on Facebook. Sometimes the people you raise turn out to be monsters. Prayers for strength. I scrolled past it. I knew she was spreading lies, claiming that I was unstable, that I'd fabricated the deed, and that I'd manipulated her for years. But I didn't counter her claims. I sat by my window, sipping coffee, and watched the trees sway in the autumn wind. I thought about all the time I'd spent trying to be a good daughter, and how it had all been in vain. Let them talk. Let them believe her lies. I knew that lies couldn't stand up to the truth forever. That evening, Ryan called. I stared at his name flashing on the screen for a few rings before answering. We hadn't really talked outside of holidays for over a year. I heard what happened, he said. She's saying you're dangerous. I waited for him to take her side, but he surprised me. She did the same thing to me 2 years ago when I stopped sending her money. She told everyone I was cutting her off out of spite, but she never mentioned the tuition I paid for Ava or the medical bills I covered after her surgery. I leaned against the wall, listening to his voice. I didn't say anything back then. I didn't want the drama. But now, if you need me to confirm anything, I will. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was a long overdue moment of understanding. Thanks, I said. I might take you up on that. He added, I should have stepped in sooner. I saw the way she talked to you, but I thought you had it under control. I did, until I didn't, I replied. He sighed. Well, I'm here now. It wasn't everything, but it was something. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of the world on my own. 2 weeks later, Vivian filed a claim of elder abuse and unlawful eviction. I read the paperwork slowly, feeling a heavy weight in my chest. But I forwarded it to my attorney. She's going to lose, he told me. It's just a smokescreen. The hearing was scheduled. I showed up with a box full of proof, bank statements, signed agreements, the deed, tax records, and even the lease that Vivian had signed years ago, acknowledging that she was living in my home as a guest. Vivian arrived in tears, telling the judge that I'd manipulated her and that she'd been emotionally mistreated. She said I'd thrown her out with nothing but a suitcase. I didn't interrupt. I let her finish her story. Then I stood up and handed the judge a binder filled with organized, labeled, and time-stamped documents. There were copies of every payment I'd made on her behalf, utility bills in my name, car repairs, medication receipts, screenshots of her texts asking for money, and voicemails where she'd thanked me in the past. The judge flipped through the pages slowly. Then he looked at Vivian. You've provided no evidence of financial abuse, no evidence of coercion, and no proof that your daughter acted unlawfully in removing you from a home that she not only owns but has paid for in detail. She started to object, but the judge raised his hand. This case is dismissed immediately. Vivian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. I didn't gloat. I simply turned to my attorney. Let's proceed with the restraining order. He nodded. I moved into a new place. It wasn't bigger or fancier, but it was truly mine. There were no more unwanted footsteps in the hallway, no second toothbrush in the bathroom, and no passive-aggressive notes on the fridge. I unpacked slowly, choosing where to put things based on my own preferences. I threw out the old towels and bought new ones in my favorite shade of blue. The first night, I slept with the window open and the door unlocked, not out of forgetfulness, but because I felt safe. A few days later, I saw my neighbor watering her plants. She looked up, smiled, and waved. I hesitated for a moment, then raised my hand and waved back. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a new beginning. I no longer had to carry around proof of who I was. I didn't have to defend myself or shrink to make someone else feel better. The silence in my home was no longer tense, it was a silence that I'd earned. In that quiet, I began to hear my own voice again, clear and steady. I started an organization called the Harmony Foundation for those who chose peace over pleasing. It was a place for people like me, who had loved deeply but had been taken advantage of. I stood in front of a room full of people, notes in hand. The sign behind me read, The Harmony Foundation for those who chose peace over pleasing. I took a deep breath and said, I'm not here to be liked anymore. I'm here to be whole. No one clapped at first. But then, one by one, people started to share their stories. They were different from mine, but they carried the same pain, the same relief, and the same hope for a better future. As I listened, I realized that I wasn't there to teach, I was there to witness. There were so many ways to heal, and my journey was just one of them. In that room, I felt a sense of peace, a feeling that I'd finally found my place.